lots of things you could do. Bury it in a tin can in the backyard, for instance. But idle money may in time depreciate. Or you could spend it on a couple of nights out a week with the wife. This seems like a lot of fun. But with this kind of life, you'd depreciate. So why not put your money to work?
Put my money to work?
That's right, Mr. Finchley. You can own a share of American business. There are over 1,200 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Companies which employ more than 11 million people, produce half of all the goods made in America, and pay about half the nation.
Welcome back to Ask the Compound, the show where you provide the questions, we provide the answers. Our email here is askthecompoundshow@gmail.com. Special show today. I've got a million questions over the years about producing content. So today we're going to talk about like how the question I get more than any other. How do you produce so much content? How do you come up with stuff to write about? How do you define your audience as a content creator? What's the best way to give live presentations? I thought this was a pretty good one. And then one of my all-time favorite questions. Am I, Ben Carlson, a permabull?
I think I know the answer.
I don't think you do. I think you're going to be surprised. Today's show is brought to you by Rocket Money. I check Rocket Money probably once a week to see what my upcoming bills are going to be, how much money I've spent in the last couple of weeks. Don't tell Rocket Money I told you this, but you can actually negotiate with them how much you pay them for the service. They have a set fee, but you can actually negotiate with them. I drive a hard bargain.
Yeah, you love negotiating.
Yeah, it's a personal finance app that finds and cancels unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. 5 million users. They've saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's features. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/ATC. That's rocketmoney.com/ATC. All right, let's do it, Duncan. By the way, the people in the comments do not like it when I give you crap about your investing prowess. People get really protective of you and defensive.
I know
every time that
it's something I enjoy the banter on the show, but yeah, some people think that it's serious. I think
leave Duncan alone, Ben. It's okay.
Yeah,
we're friends.
It's all in good fun.
All right, let's do a question.
Okay, up first today we have: how do you produce so much content and come up with topics to write about?
Again, I get this question all the time. Especially, there's a lot of financial advisors, especially, that want to do this, and a lot of people just like to produce content. So let's bring on one of everyone's favorite content creators, our friend Morgan Housel.
Hey, Morgan.
Hey guys, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Morgan, this is the question I get a lot. I think anyone who produces content on a regular basis has to think about this. Like, how did you get into this whole thing where you became a writer on a regular basis? You know, was this something you did before you got to the Motley Fool, or was this a habit that you developed later in life?
I'd done absolutely none of it before the Motley Fool. I'd never written anything before they started paying me to be a writer, which was terrifying. And the results were very predictable. It was awful at first. And my first decade as a writer at the Motley Fool, I was paid per article, which is a very good incentive to keep writing and crank out as much as you can. And I think what I've learned over the years, I'm sure this is the same for you, is that the best ideas are rare and you can't force them. You can't sit down at your desk and say, okay, at 8:52, I'm going to be creative. It just doesn't work like that. You have to be in the right mood and it strikes you randomly. I would often look back, like during my Motley Fool days, if I was writing 200 blog posts per year, I would look back and say 5 of them were really good. 5 of them I was proud of out of the 200. Because you can't, it's impossible just to recreate those ideas. And just say, I'm going to come up with a good idea every single day. It just doesn't work like that. But I think if you spend your time casually reading, unstructured reading, not looking for an idea, but just trying to learn about the world, they'll come to you enough. You'll find enough of them to hit you, but it's never easy and you can't structure it. You can't build a formula around it.
I'm a big fan of the whole standing on the shoulders of giants too. Like, a lot of the good ideas have already happened too, and it's like, it's kind of taking your own worldview and putting them on those ideas, or taking your current worldview and putting on what's ever happening now. Yeah. So the old Jason Zweig thing about just writing the same thing over and over again in a different way, finding new and interesting ways to say the same thing that you already know, or like the building blocks. That's how I think about it. I was going to ask you about the reading. I do think reading a lot of other people is important, not because it shapes your opinions. in different ways, but it gives you different ways of thinking about the world. And like, oh, I could use this or that. And to your point about the getting stuff in different ways, like I've never been a fan of like meditating. I know that's like a billionaire thing to do, right? That's a top 10 list of what you do in your morning routine is you have to meditate. But I find meditation for me is like I go for a couple of short runs a week, like 3 or 4 times a week I go running. And that's where I get my best thinking. And so to your point, if you're just beating your head against the wall trying to come up with stuff to write about, I don't think it's the kind of thing that just magically comes to you. You have to be in like the right frame of mind to get it. And Barry always talks about how like, I can't remember the quote exactly. Like, I write to know what it is that I really think. And so for me, it's like writing is a form of figuring out what it is that you actually think about something in an organized way.
Did you get any good ideas when you ran into that poisonous plant in California, Ben?
I was going to figure out how to sue someone for it, maybe. But
that's a good idea. I would say, Ben, if I look back, 80% of the best ideas that I've been proudest of came either on a run, on an airplane, or 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. And 0% of them came when I was sitting at my desk trying to think of a good idea to write about. That's always the case.
Right. It's somehow clearing your mind, and yeah. But I think the whole thing for writing for me is that I was just like you. Before I started my blog, I never wrote anything. I hated writing in college. I hated writing in high school. The big thing for a lot of people is finding a subject and a topic that you actually enjoy writing about. I think you've talked about this before. Like if you are writing or producing content about something that you're not interested in, it's going to show to the audience. They're going to know that you're kind of a fraud. Like I write about stuff that interests me, and it's great if other people are interested in it, but selfishly, I'm doing that for my personal gain as well.
That's absolutely chase. One other topic here. I just saw this yesterday. It was an interview with Bob Dylan, and most of his music, his best music at least, he wrote in the 1960s. And he said it was a recent interview, and he was like, it would be impossible for him to do that again. He was like, I was in a mood in the 1960s that I cannot recreate. It's impossible to recreate. So even though he has 50 years more experience now, he was way more talented back then in a way that he could not replicate today.
Yes, and I think there's something to finding your own voice. One of the reasons that I was attracted to the financial blogs in the first place, the first people I really started reading religiously were Josh and Barry. You know, Barry's been doing it forever, and the one thing I really liked about it is that they had their own style and their own voice, and I think you have to be able to find that in yourself too. Not that you have to like recreate what other people are doing, but you have to, I don't know, either write like you talk or share stuff that's interesting to you that you care about. I think that being that like true to yourself is a big part of it too.
Yeah, I mean, writing is a pure meritocracy. If you're good, you'll get noticed. And if you're not good, you won't get noticed. It's a very humbling thing to do. But the people who get noticed are the ones who write for themselves and write in their own voice. If you're writing what you think other people want to hear, and you're doing it in a very, very generic tone with no style, you're just putting facts on the page, it's not going to go anywhere. That's always been the case.
Right. I always have a lot of financial advisors come to me and say, I want to build an audience, right? I want to start a blog or start a Substack or start a YouTube, whatever. I want to build an audience. And I always tell them that's like the totally wrong way to go about it. Yeah. Like, do something for yourself first, and if an audience comes because of it, great. But don't do it with the explicit goal of building an audience. If I would have started blogging with the goal of building an audience and like building a brand and all those things that people do today, I would have given up immediately when it didn't happen right away. Right. Because if you say the expectation's too high, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah. There's this other story that I love from Mr. Beast. He says there are a lot of young YouTubers that come to him and ask for advice. And he always says the same thing. He says, go make 100 videos and then I'll give you advice. And he said 99% of them don't make 100 videos. They quit before that. Or if they do make 100 videos, they don't need his advice anymore. I think there's a lot of truth to that too. Like, you just got to put in the reps early on when nobody's watching. You're not getting any page views, nobody's paying attention, but you're doing it because you enjoy it. You're doing it for yourself. And like Barry said, you're doing it to find out what you actually think, to crystallize your own thinking.
Someone in the live chat asked about, like, what do you think about AI? Are you using any of the tools yet to help you? Like, do you take something you write and put it in there and say, give me some feedback or ask some questions? Do you do any of that stuff yet?
I've tried it a couple times just to experiment. And I would say it is very good at macro feedback, which I would say, like, you upload a blog post or a chapter and it'll give you very high level, like, oh, there are a couple holes in here in this. It is not good at what I'd call micro feedback, which is just like, are there any typos in here? Are there any grammatical errors? Can I shorten any sentence? It's not good at that at all, I found. But macro feedback of high level, like, oh, these are your big ideas, but you could expand on this a little bit more. It's actually not that bad on that. I would say it's as good as like a young, inexperienced editor would do. Like pretty good, and you're going to help me a little bit, but it's not incredible feedback yet.
This is a bit of a segue for the next question, but as a reader of you guys' content, I think it's very easy for people to write about finance and come across extremely condescending, but you guys both are able to avoid that, which I think that's what your fans appreciate, right? Is that you're able to have a lot of really valuable information and dive deep on a lot of topics, but it doesn't come across as condescending or like you're up on the mountain and everyone else is below.
Well, here, throw up the next question. I think this is a good segue here.
Yeah. So up next we have, how do you define your audience when producing content?
So I think this is important. I remember Bob Pisani was pushing his book last year at Future Proof, and he talked about how he didn't know what he was doing at first at CNBC until he figured out, and he was like a real estate reporter, and he realized like I have to define my audience, and he did it very explicitly. He's like, it's a 40-year-old woman who lives in Minneapolis and she works part-time, and he did all these things, and he said, I'm producing content and my message is just for her. And I don't think some people think about that. My audience when I first started writing was just my friends and family. Like I'm thinking about like my father-in-law and my brother, my sister, my brother-in-law, like asking me questions about the markets. And I tried to simplify it to like the lowest common denominator for them and speak in plain English. And I didn't like do that I didn't really do it on purpose. I did it because they were the only ones reading my blog at first, right? And I think you have to figure out, like, to your point, Duncan, about being too condescending. Like, who are you talking to in the first place? Do you ever think about that at all, Morgan? Like, who the end reader is?
I think I could give you two opposite answers to this question. One is the audience is one, it's me. I'm writing things that I would want to read and stories that I find interesting. And I think when you do that, it's the most genuine. You do your best work. The other end of the spectrum is I hope I'm writing for everybody. And a lot of publishers for books really want you to define your audience, like Bob Pisani was.
Right.
And my answer is not the answer they want to hear. I'm like, hopefully everybody. I want hopefully everyone to read this book. Many years ago, for a short period of time, I was writing at the Wall Street Journal, and one of the editors said, when you write for the Wall Street Journal, it needs to be something that a hedge fund manager will learn something from, and a soccer mom in Iowa will understand. It has to be both those things at the same time. And I actually think that's possible. I think it's possible to do that by telling a good story that an expert will learn something from and a novice will understand at the same time. So I do that. I think when I'm writing, I think I'm always just thinking through the lens of, do I like this? Am I interested in this? Did I learn something in the process of writing this article? But I think the ultimate goal is I hope this is understandable and maybe enjoyable to everybody. So both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. Jason Zweig told me when I wrote my first book, I asked him for some advice, and he said, like, pick 10 things that you want your grandmother to take away from this book and write those out first, and then write the book based on those like big building blocks that like she would understand. I also think if we're niching it down to financial advisors, who are, again, the people who ask me a lot of questions on this, what I tell them is that your audience is your current clients. Like, don't worry about anyone beyond that. Answer questions that you know your current clients are going to ask you, because we kind of know what is going to be asked depending on the market. Is the market up? What questions are you going to get then? Is the market down? What question are you going to get then? Are rates up? Are rates down? You kind of know what people are going to come to you with, because those different financial feelings are evergreen. Like the feelings we get from certain events that happen in the marketplace, those never really change. So answer those questions for them first, and that builds like a library of content that you can then give to future clients that you've already answered these questions for them.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between people writing a newsletter or a quarterly update for their clients that's a very specific audience, and someone who's trying to become an online writer. And I think if it's the latter, it's so difficult early on to catch people's attention that you have to cast the widest net that you can and write something that will hopefully be understandable to everybody. If you are starting out as a brand new writer and it's very niche, it's like the odds are so stacked against you that you're ever going to build a critical mass of audience.
Yes, I totally agree. Which is, again, for most people, there was far less competition, I think, when you and I first started writing.
Yeah.
10 or 12 years ago, whenever it was. But there are so many different holes, and I think for some people, finding a niche is probably your only shot at actually developing a little bit of an audience. And what's the Kevin Kelly thing? Find your 1,000 fans or whatever. Like
true fans,
yeah, that should probably be the goal for most people. Not to develop a big audience, but to do something that like certain people are going to find something out of. But it's I guess to your point, there's no really right answer here.
Yeah,
I think it's true. Trying to get out of it.
But I also think if you look at you, Michael, Josh, Barry, Nick, me, we write about all kinds of stuff. And none of us are like, oh, I write about interest rate spreads, and that's what I do. It's like, no, I write about like all kinds of things related to money, personal finance, investing, stocks, bonds, all kinds of things. And that's why I think casting the widest net comes in. Like, hopefully, if you're interested in money at all of those 6 writers who I just mentioned, hopefully there's going to be something in there for you somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's what the great things about finance is. There's so many different aspects of it. It's the personal finance stuff. It's the investing, it's the psychology, it's the numbers, it's the graphs. There's so many different avenues you can go. And that's one of the reasons that I find it so fascinating to write about, because there are all these different angles that you can hit on all the time.
Absolutely.
Constantly changing. All right. Next question, Duncan.
Okay. I'm giving more presentations for my job. Any advice on incorporating visuals and data into presentations? How much should I lean on data versus storytelling?
Okay, so Morgan, I think you've written about public speaking before. We've actually spoke at the same conference a number of times. You do a great, your whole thing is always the best story wins, right? And you're very good at telling those stories. I'm curious how you try to balance that, especially for people in the finance world that are just more drawn to numbers, right? That want to share that. Like, how do you balance the desire to share numbers with the need to tell stories, because that's what people actually remember?
Mike Antonelli talks about this a lot. He speaks at conferences too, and he always makes a comment without naming anyone, of course. He's like, the bar for speaking at financial conferences is so low because the vast majority of presentations are just a data dump of charts. And everyone in the audience they're not going to remember them, and they're kind of nodding off. And there's so much data on one slide that no one can even figure out what's going on the slide anyways. So the opposite end of that spectrum was Steve Jobs, who was like, if you need PowerPoint, your presentation has already failed. You should just be able to tell the story. Even if it's a technical topic, you should just be able to talk about it in a way that people will understand. And I think visuals, particularly charts and data and lots of numbers on a presentation, on a PowerPoint deck at a conference is actually very ineffective. People can go home and maybe then they can study the slide if they're interested in it. But when they're sitting in a chair, they just want to hear your story. That's all they want to do. And I actually think it is pretty possible to condense a chart and data into a narrative story. It's not that difficult to do. And if you can do it, you rise straight to the top, not just at conferences, but at your company when you're presenting to clients and talking to clients. If you're just throwing data in their face, most of the time it's in one ear, out the next. If you tell them a story, they might actually remember it. And I always think about this of like back in college, every formula that I was forced to memorize before a test, I forgot it 10 minutes after the test. It's impossible to hang on to that information. But every good story that I heard, even when I was a child, I still remember it today. You can actually take that away with you and remember it versus just a data dump that no one's going to remember.
Yeah, that's how everything was passed down before books even existed, right? Before the printing press was there. Public speaking, just like writing, just like you, the early stuff I wrote, I look back and I cringe at it. But I think it's almost like the writing muscle is something that you can develop. You do it more and you can get better at it and you can improve upon it. It's not something that you're just born. Some people are obviously born with those skills, but other people develop them. Same thing with public speaking for me. And I think it was actually a harder one to develop. I was not great at giving presentations when I first started. How did you try to develop those communication skills? Because some people, again, are just born with this. Like I've seen Scott Galloway give presentations before. The guy is amazing, and obviously he practices hard. He practices at it a lot because he's very good at the stories, and sometimes you hear him say the same stories over and over again. But he's drilled it into his head, and I've seen him give presentations where he goes through 120 slides, but he's telling a different narrative and story for each one of those. But for the people who aren't really born with that gift, how do you help people develop better communication skills when it comes to talking? Because I think that's a lot harder than writing for some people.
Yeah, it's a very different skill. I saw this interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the interviewer said, "How are you so damn eloquent? Everything you say is like poetry." And he said, "You think that's true, but everything that I say on these interviews, I wrote 10 years ago, and I've said them verbatim on 700 other interviews. So you think I just came up with this off the top of my head? Every one of these words was rehearsed in practice, and that's why I sound more eloquent than you think I am." I think for most presenters, that's the case, that if you do a presentation right, it seems like you're just speaking off the top of your head. Scott Galloway, I think, is very good at this, where I think his style of presenting gives the impression that he is speaking off the cuff. And this is no offense to him. He's not. Those are prepared remarks. And that's why it sounds so good. So it's such a cliche answer, but like you got to practice a zillion times. I remember the first real presentation I gave, like a 40-minute presentation at an investing conference. I probably rehearsed it from start to finish 50 times over the previous 2 months. And the other thing that's so important about public speaking is it's terrifying, particularly early on. And I think those nerves and that adrenaline actually helps. And most people will, well, maybe not most, but some people will give their best performance when they're the most nervous. I've noticed this in my history of public speaking, that if it's a small event and I'm like, there's zero pressure here, I'm just going to go out here and do this, it's not that good. And I think the best presentations I've given have been the big events where I am sweating backstage before I go on. I think that adrenaline can actually really help you.
I always tell my kids to lean into the nerves. Like my daughter will say, I'm nervous because of this big soccer tournament. And I'll tell her, like, that's a good thing. If you're nervous, that means like it's important to you and it's exciting, and you should try to use that to your advantage. I totally agree with you. And the preparation thing it's kind of the only thing you can do, because I one of the very first presentations I gave, I tried to wing it, and it's like, I got this. I got a few bullet points and I totally bombed. I did awful. And I look back on it and I go, what was I thinking? What? Because now I do it, to your point, I rehearse. There was a similar story of Neil deGrasse Tyson about Martin Short. Jimmy Kimmel said that Martin Short was the greatest late night talk show guest ever. And because, they come in, they do 5 minutes, right? And it's story, setup, story, punchline. And they have this whole thing. And Martin Short told the New Yorker one time in an interview, he said, like, that 5 minutes, that is me pretending to be a relaxed person. He said, what I do is I send like 19 pages ahead of time to the producer. And we whittle that 19 pages down to like 3 or 4 paragraphs that we go over. And he said, I practice and I practice and I practice for hours on end to get that 5 minutes that looks like a relaxed version of me. But he goes, it's not me at all. It's totally rehearsed. And I think that's the whole thing, is that, like, if you want to make it look easy, you have to put hard work in first before you even get there. You can't just like get up there and do it. And that's the thing that I totally missed early on. It's way harder than you think.
I think this is true for writing too. I'm sure you've experienced this a million times, of people who will write you and be like, hey, I started a blog and I've written 3 blog posts and no one's reading it. What's going on? And you're like, yeah, keep doing that for another 10 years and then come back to me. It takes a lot of hard work to get there. Like, shocker.
Yes, and that's half of it is just showing up. Think about how many people used to write blogs when we first started in this, that they just kind of slowly but surely went away, and you think back like, oh, whatever happened to that person? Because it's hard to keep doing it over and over again, and there has to be something personal you get out of it, I think. But,
yeah, I think that was what was helpful for me, was the fact that I was doing it as my profession from day one. So it was like, I can't quit, otherwise I won't be able to feed my family next week. I have to keep doing this even when it sucks.
All right, we got one more question. This next one's one of my favorite questions, and I think it's good for Morgan too.
Yeah, this is a recurring theme in the comments and things. So yeah, this is a good one. So this one is just, Ben Carlson, do you think it's fair to describe you as a permabull? I like that. It sounds like a deposition. Ben
All right,
Carlson.
John, I think there's this is from Twitter actually. So throw this up. I can't remember what I wrote. I wrote something positive about the economy, so it seems like a contrarian position these days. But someone said, just wondering, because what I see from you lately is buy and hold forever. Don't try to ever time this. You'll be wrong, etc. Now, John, throw up Morgan's tweet from this week. You kind of wrote something similar, Morgan, about basically long-term buy and hold is imperfect, subject to long stretches of low negative returns, and better than anything else for 99% of investors. I think you and I share similar mindset in terms of glasses half full, optimistic, but I would personally never, ever in a million years describe myself as a permabull, because I don't think it's possible to be permanently bullish if we're talking markets or the economy, when I know the history shows me that there's recessions, there's downturns, there's crashes, there's corrections, there's bad stuff that's going to happen, and I know those bad things are going to happen. Despite all that, I'm still positive about the future, because, and I think actually reading history has been the biggest help for me on this. So how do you have sort of an optimistic bent about the future when it seems like fewer and fewer people these days have that mindset?
I think it all comes down to your time horizon. That's a very cliche answer, but that's exactly what it is. I mean, look at the last 24 years, 2000 to 2024. The stock market's done pretty well. Even starting at the bubble high of 2000, the average annual return is really not that bad. But during that period, you had 10 years where the market really went nowhere, crashed, and then kind of went nowhere for a long time. You had the financial crisis. You had all these 20% declines between then. You had COVID and the market lost half its value. You had inflation in the last couple of years. But through all of that, if you held on, you actually did just fine. And that was during one of the worst 24-year periods. That's starting at the peak of the dot-com bubble as your starting point. So look, I think over the next 50 years, I hope I'll be an investor for the next 50 years. The odds that the market will be meaningfully higher and like satisfactorily higher than it is today, 50 years from now, like on an average annual basis, I think those odds are very high. I don't know, 90%, something like that. I'm pulling that out of thin air, but let's say it's 90% odds that it'll be meaningfully higher in 50 years. But I also know with 100% certainty that over the next 50 years, there'll be multiple 50% crashes. There'll be decades where you look back and say that the returns were low. There will be surprises, recessions, pandemics, like on and on and on. That's a 100% chance that that's going to happen. And I don't think those two things contradict each other. That I'm extremely confident over the next 50 years and more confident that the next 50 years are going to be miserable at almost every given point in time. I think getting over that seeming contradiction is what you need to do well over time.
Yeah, there's this. I mean, the perfect example right now is just watching how people think about politics. It's cognitive dissonance. It's very hard for people to have those two thoughts in their head at once. Like, I know the downturns and the bad times will happen, but I still think the good times will win. And getting back to history shows our whole history of the species is tragedy and conflict and war and all these really bad things, and yet we've still continued to progress and improve and innovate as a species, and the stock market has still done well. And I think that's where I find some solace there. But I also think your personal experiences shape you in a lot of ways. Michael and I just got off a podcast interview with Jared Dillian, and he talked about how he came up at Lehman Brothers, and he lived through the dot-com boom and bust, and then 9/11, and then Lehman Brothers happened, and his whole company went under, and he saw people lose all their money. And he said, listen, hand up, that gave me a bearish bent on the world. I saw all this happen in my formative years. I saw my peers and my coworkers lose everything. And in this decade-long period, he said it's shaped me for the rest of my career in terms of how I invest. And he said he doesn't trust the stock market anymore, so he invests in this other stuff, and he has a different way of thinking about investing. But I think you have to take that into account, too, that how your personal experience has shaped you, and then figure out ways to sort of create a strategy around that. I actually thought coming up during the Great Financial Crisis was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
Because I saw one of the biggest crises ever firsthand. I saw what it did to people, how they changed, how incentives worked, how career risk worked, all this stuff. And for me, it actually made me more positive about the future, like living through one of those and showing that, oh, you actually can survive something like this. And when it seemed like the world was going to end, but not everyone takes that same feeling out of it. So it's your personal experience is a big part of it too.
When you've experienced something like that, and then we still ended up more or less just fine, at least most people, then when people are talking about the risk of a 10% decline, you're like, what we dealt with in 2008 is orders of magnitude scarier than that, and we all ended up just fine today. The other thing that's important is if you talk about today's market valuations, and someone said, or like that Goldman Sachs report this week, the next 10 years, the S&P will average 3% per year, whatever it was. Let's say that's true. And that's a low return. That sucks. I guarantee you that 99% of trading strategies that try to earn higher returns given that situation are going to earn less than 3%. So it's not that, like, if someone says you're a perma bull and you should always stay invested, that doesn't mean I think returns are always going to be phenomenal in every given period. It just means that the alternatives, the strategies that you're proposing to try to do better, are almost certainly going to do worse.
Right. It's like taking the Churchill quote, buy and hold is the worst strategy except for all the other ones. That's the kind of thinking, right? It's like, I know this is imperfect, but I still think it's hard to beat with all the other stuff out there.
Yeah, and the idea of so many market pundits who think they're trying to protect you from a 20% decline, when what they really did was prevent you from enjoying a 600% return over the last 15 years or whatever it was.
Yes, it's hard. It's hard to be optimistic about the future because we're inundated with negativity on a regular basis. But and part of it is personality. I think that's just the way that I am drawn to. That's kind of the way I was born. But I think if you don't have that personality trait, you have to fight against it in a lot of ways.
And I think that the ultimate irony here maybe is that the reason the market will do well over the next 50 years is specifically because it's going to be chaotic in the interim. That's what you're getting paid for. If you can put up with that, and everyone else on Twitter is going to be calling you an idiot for putting up with it and saying, the market fell, you loser. But your ability to put up with that is what you're getting paid for.
Yeah, it's a risk premium.
Right.
So Ben just told a formative experience of his that shaped how he views markets and money. Can you share an experience of yours, Morgan, that shaped how you view money? This is a big part of your book, obviously, for those that have read it. But
yeah, and Ben and I are similar age, started our careers at similar times. So 2008, 2009, that was absolutely formative for me. I graduated college in 2008, so that was my first experience in the job market. And in finance, it was absolutely terrifying. Nobody was not only was nobody hiring, everybody was laying off. And I wanted to work at a hedge fund or a private equity firm and forget about it. I remember one time in 2008, it was 2007, before I started writing, I submitted my resume to a private equity firm and I didn't hear anything back. And I emailed them a week later, like, hey, I just want to make sure you got my resume. And someone wrote back and said, hey, we're sorry, we laid off our entire HR department, so there's no one to respond anymore. That was what trying to get a job in finance was like in 2007. And I was absolutely terrified. It was so scary for me because I had no skills. I was not that confident just in myself in general, and the market was a mess. And so for 3 years, every morning, I still so vividly remember this, every morning checking my email and being like, is this going to be the day that I get an email saying, thanks for your time, but we're gonna have to let you go. And that I think that fear will never leave me.
The weird part about that is I had a lot of that same experience where I couldn't find a job for years on end, trying. And I think back to, I'm so thankful for all the jobs that I didn't get. And you never see that at the time, right? Like if I would have got that job and I would have stayed there, I probably would have been miserable. And I'm just, sometimes you're glad stuff that didn't happen in your life.
Yes. For me, it was 2010. I applied for a job at Amazon that I didn't get. And I was so bummed at the time. I was so devastated. And yeah, looking back, what would have, it's crazy to think what things would have been.
I graduated in 2009 with a degree in film. So it was a rough few years.
Yeah. And if you compare that to people who graduated in 1999 or whatever, who had the exact opposite experience, they graduate and they have 50 job offers waiting for them. Just a very different experience that will shape how we went through the rest of our lives. Not because one of us is smarter than one another. It's just because we happen to be born a couple years apart and experienced something different at a different point in our life.
Has working for a venture capital fund changed your thought process on being optimistic about the future in any way? Like, do you see these people who are constantly trying to shape the future as like ways to have optimism? Because I actually think talking with young people makes me more bullish on the future than almost anything these days.
One thing that sticks out from VC that is, I think it's true in all aspects of life, it's just magnified in VC, so you see it clear, is how much tails drive everything. So a classic in venture capital, you make 100 investments, you're going to lose money on 90% of them. You'll make all your money on 2 of them. And the 2 of them that become blockbusters were never the ones that you thought were going to be big when you made your investment. And it's always the case that if we look back at our firm 10 years ago, we would have said, oh, these 5 companies in our portfolio, those are going to be the big ones. And they weren't. The ones that we ended up, we did have 5 that became big. And there were ones that we weren't even paying attention to. Like we made the investments, we're like, okay, we'll make it. I don't know what that company's really doing. That went on to become Upstart or Lyft. And it's so not only do tails drive everything, but you never know what the tails are going to be. I think it's almost impossible to predict what they're going to be.
Right. Yeah, which is also true in the stock market in a lot of ways.
True in the stock market, true in your careers, true with your friendships, like true in politics, that a small number of events drive everything. And it's almost impossible to predict what those events are going to be.
Right. Well said. Anything you need to plug today? Any new books coming out anytime soon? You working on something?
Well, I just finished a book recently. I finished it a month ago, and it'll be out next year. It's called The Art of Spending Money. It's going to be next to that collection that you just put up.
Oh, love it.
Wow, already a third. I feel like Same as Ever just came out. They've got you working hard.
I do too. It's been busy, right?
I love the topic because that's one of the few personal finance areas that not enough time gets spent on. There's plenty of time talking about frugality and saving. Very few people talk about spending money. I like it.
It was fun. It was fun to put together. I'm excited about it.
All right. Thank you to Morgan for joining us. This was great. Remember, our email here, askthecompoundshow@gmail.com. If you have any questions for us, we appreciate it. Thank you to Duncan, everyone on the production staff behind the scenes. Thanks everyone in the live chat. Thanks everyone watching live on Twitter, which we didn't know was a thing before, Morgan. You can watch these YouTube shows live on Twitter now.
I like it. That's good.
It's fun. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.